than iron chains, and when the auctioneer brought down his gavel for the final time, the sale price exceeded $42,000. In today's currency, that represents nearly $1.3 million for a single human being. For context, the most expensive plantation sale that year, including the manor house, 200 acres of prime cotton land, and 37 enslaved workers, brought $38,000. No public record explains why 17 different men bid against each other with increasing desperation. No newspaper dared print the details of what transpired in that room. And no official document names the buyer, who ultimately claimed ownership, though 3 witnesses later testified that he departed Charleston the same day, traveling north with his purchase, and was never seen in South Carolina again. The Charleston Mercury archives contain a brief mention of the sale, buried on page 9 between shipping notices and advertisements for patent medicine. 7 words: unusual proceedings at Ryan's establishment, no further comment. The following week, the newspaper's editor resigned without explanation and left the state. The week after that, Ryan's auction house closed permanently, its records sealed by court order, its building sold to a shipping merchant who converted it into a warehouse within the month. What made this woman worth more than a working plantation? What secret did she possess that drove Charleston's elite into a bidding frenzy that bordered on madness? What knowledge could justify a price so astronomical that banks refused to process the transaction through normal channels, requiring the buyer to transport the payment in physical gold? Before we continue with the story that Charleston tried desperately to bury, we need you to be part of uncovering these forgotten truths. Subscribe to The Sealed Room and turn on notifications, because stories this deliberately erased from history need to be told. And leave a comment telling us what you think this woman knew that was worth more than gold. We want to hear your theories. Now let us return to that October morning when something impossible happened on Chalmers Street. Charleston in 1854 occupied a peculiar position in the American South. The city considered itself the jewel of Southern culture, its cobblestone streets lined with elegant townhouses painted in soft pastels, its harbor bustling with ships carrying cotton to Liverpool and rice to Boston. The Battery Promenade stretched along the waterfront, where wealthy families strolled in the evening beneath palmetto trees that rustled in the Atlantic breeze. Church spires pierced the sky from every neighborhood, their bells marking time in a city that moved with languid grace, secure in its prosperity and confident in its permanence. The population exceeded 40,000 souls, split almost evenly between enslaved and free, though power concentrated entirely in the hands of perhaps 300 families who controlled the plantations, the banks, the shipping companies, and every mechanism of commerce that generated wealth. These families knew each other intimately, their fortunes intertwined through marriages, business partnerships, and social obligations that stretched back generations. The Ravenels, the Pringles, the Haywoods, the Middletons, names that appeared on deeds, on bank charters, on the boards of every significant institution. They dined together at the Charleston Club, worshipped at Street Michael's or Street Phillips, and conducted business in offices along Broad Street, where deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were sealed with handshakes between men who had known each other since childhood. But beneath this surface of gentility and prosperity, Charleston harbored secrets. Every great fortune rests on foundations that prefer darkness, and in a city built on the backs of enslaved labor, those foundations contained multitudes of buried crimes, convenient disappearances, and documents that recorded transactions better left unexamined. Ryan's auction house occupied a 3-story building on Chalmers Street, just 2 blocks from the market, where enslaved people were bought and sold like livestock every Tuesday and Friday. The establishment catered to a wealthier clientele than the public market, offering privacy, discretion, and guarantees of quality that attracted plantation owners from as far as Georgia and North Carolina. Marcus Ryan, the proprietor, had conducted sales for 23 years, building a reputation for honesty in a business where honesty was a negotiable commodity. He kept immaculate records, verified the papers of every person he sold, and maintained relationships with the banks that financed these transactions. His word carried weight among men who trusted few people. The morning of October 11th began with routine business. The first lots consisted of household servants from an estate being settled after the owner's death: a cook, 2 maids, a coachman, and a gardener. They sold for predictable prices to predictable buyers. Ryan moved through the proceedings with practiced efficiency, his voice carrying clearly through the room where approximately 60 men sat in ladder-back chairs, fanning themselves against the October warmth that still clung to Charleston even as autumn approached. Then at precisely 10:30, according to the pocket watch of a cotton factor named Benjamin Whitmore, who later provided testimony, the atmosphere changed. A door at the rear of the auction room opened, and 2 men entered, flanking a woman whose appearance immediately commanded attention. She stood perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, unusually tall for that era, with posture so erect it suggested military bearing. Her skin showed the deep brown of African ancestry, unmarred by the scars that typically accumulated on enslaved bodies subjected to field labor or physical punishment. She wore a dress of excellent quality, dark blue cotton with small buttons along the bodice, clothing far finer than what enslaved people typically possessed. Her hair had been arranged in an intricate pattern of braids that must have required hours to complete, suggesting she had access to time and assistance unavailable to ordinary plantation workers. But it was her expression that caused the assembled buyers to fall silent. She surveyed the room with eyes that revealed no fear, no shame, no submission. Instead, her gaze moved deliberately from face to face, pausing occasionally, as though cataloguing and memorizing every person present. Several men would later report feeling distinctly uncomfortable under that scrutiny, as though she were the one evaluating them rather than the reverse. The 2 men escorting her wore clothing that marked them as travelers: dusty boots, coats showing wear from long use, the appearance of having ridden considerable distance. More significantly, they carried themselves with a wariness that suggested they expected trouble and were prepared to respond. Both wore pistols openly at their belts, unusual for an auction house where weapons were typically prohibited. Marcus Ryan descended from his platform, confusion evident on his face despite his years of professional composure. He approached the escorts, speaking in low tones that those nearest the front could barely distinguish. One of the men produced a leather portfolio, extracting papers that Ryan examined with increasing consternation. His lips moved silently as he read, his expression cycling through surprise, disbelief, and something approaching fear. He looked at the woman, then back at the documents, then at the woman again. She met his gaze steadily, and for just a moment the corners of her mouth lifted in what might have been a smile, though it vanished so quickly that witnesses later disagreed about whether they had actually seen it. Ryan returned to his platform, the papers clutched in his hand. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, and his voice carried an uncertainty that veteran attendees of his auctions had never heard before. "Gentlemen, we have before us an exceptional lot. The seller, who chooses to remain anonymous as is their legal right under South Carolina law, has consigned a woman of approximately 30 years of age. No name is provided on the bill of sale, so she will be designated as Lot 47. Her origin is listed as Charleston, though no previous owner is named. She possesses no documented history of fieldwork or household service." A voice from the middle of the room called out with skeptical irritation, "Then what's her value, Ryan? Why bring her here?" Ryan's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened where he gripped the papers. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear. "The seller has established an opening bid of $10,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Men stopped fanning themselves. The scratch of a pen from a clerk taking notes ceased abruptly. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to diminish, as though the entire city had paused to absorb what had just been spoken. $10,000 exceeded the annual income of most men in that room. It represented enough wealth to purchase a substantial plantation, a townhouse in Charleston's most fashionable neighborhood, or a ship capable of transatlantic trade. For a single woman with no documented skills or work history, the price was madness. "Have you lost your mind, Ryan?" someone shouted. Others joined in, voices rising in angry confusion. But Marcus Ryan did not lower the price. Instead, he did something unprecedented in his 23 years of conducting auctions. He read from the seller's papers in a voice that grew quieter with each sentence, forcing the angry crowd to fall silent in order to hear. The seller provides the following sworn statement, notarized before a magistrate in Charleston on October 6th of this year. The property designated as Lot 47 possesses specific knowledge of events and transactions conducted by certain parties between the years 1846 and 1853. This knowledge has been verified through demonstration before 3 independent witnesses whose identities remain sealed for their protection. The purchaser will receive, along with the bill of sale, detailed instructions regarding the conditions under which this knowledge may be disclosed. The seller guarantees the accuracy and completeness of all information, and further guarantees that this knowledge cannot be extracted through coercion, as the property has been conditioned to remain silent under such circumstances. Ryan paused, his face pale. The seller concludes with the following statement. Any party with interest in events occurring at the Magnolia Plantation on June 19, 1849, or with concern for the disposition of certain documents currently believed destroyed in the warehouse fire of April 1851, or with involvement in the maritime incident of September 1848, will recognize the value of securing this lot. The seller accepts no responsibility for consequences arising from this knowledge becoming public. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several men stood abruptly, their faces flushed. Others leaned back in their chairs, expressions carefully neutral but eyes betraying calculation. 3 men departed the auction room immediately, walking quickly toward the door without explanation. But significantly, no one called for Ryan to end the proceedings. No one suggested the entire affair was a fraud or a waste of time. Because everyone in that room understood what Ryan had just read. The woman standing silently on the platform possessed knowledge of specific events, specific crimes, specific secrets that Charleston's elite had worked for years to bury. And someone had brought her here to sell that knowledge to the highest bidder. Ryan's voice cracked slightly as he spoke again. "The opening bid is $10,000. Do I hear 10,000? For a long moment, no one moved. Then from the back corner of the room, a hand rose slowly. The man attached to it was middle-aged, his face weathered by sun and wind, his clothing suggesting plantation ownership of moderate success. 10,000, he said, his voice hoarse. 12,000. The second bid came immediately from a different corner, spoken by a younger man whose fashionable clothing and gold watch chain marked him as Charleston gentry. What followed would be discussed in hushed conversations for years afterward, always in private, never where servants or strangers might overhear. The bidding escalated with speed that defied all economic logic. 15,000. 18,000. 22,000. Men who had come to purchase field hands found themselves competing for something far more valuable and far more dangerous than labor. They were bidding for protection, for the power to control information that could destroy reputations, bankrupt families, or lead to criminal prosecution. The woman on the platform never moved, never spoke. Her expression remained composed, almost serene, as the price attached to her body climbed higher and higher. But her eyes continued their steady surveillance of the room, and more than one bidder would later claim that when her gaze landed on them, They felt she was calculating exactly how much they could afford, exactly how desperate they were, exactly how much they had to lose. At $30,000, only 5 bidders remained. At $35,000, 3. The competition had narrowed to men whose wealth and power exceeded that of ordinary plantation owners. These were bankers, shipping magnates, men who controlled not just their own fortunes, but the economic destiny of entire industries. 38,000, said a man seated near the front, his voice steady despite the staggering sum he had just offered. His name was Cornelius Ashford, and he controlled 2 of Charleston's largest banks. 40,000. The response came from a figure seated in the shadows at the rear of the room, a man whose face remained difficult to see despite his proximity to others. The room gasped collectively. $40,000 exceeded the value of most working plantations with all their land, buildings, and enslaved workers included. It represented wealth that few men in the South could claim to possess in liquid assets. Cornelius Ashford sat frozen, his face twisted with rage and something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to stare at the man who had just outbid him, trying to identify him in the shadows. Finally, he shook his head slowly, stood, and walked toward the exit with rigid dignity, though everyone present could see his hands trembling. The shadowed bidder stood and moved forward into better light. He was tall, perhaps 45 years old, with a face that revealed nothing. His clothing was expensive but subdued, black coat and vest, no ostentatious jewelry, nothing to draw attention. Those who recognized him knew him only as Mr. Whitlock, a name that appeared on no Charleston social registers, no business directories, no church memberships. He had arrived in Charleston 6 weeks earlier, taken rooms at the Planters Hotel, and conducted business with a dozen different parties, always meetings held in private, always transactions that left no public record. $42,000, Whitlock said calmly, as though naming a price for tobacco rather than for a human being. No one else bid. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute as Marcus Ryan scanned the room, waiting for any final offer. None came. "Sold," Ryan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lot 47, to the gentleman for $42,000. The transaction took nearly 2 hours to complete. Whitlock produced a letter of credit from a Boston bank that required verification by telegram, a process that involved sending a clerk running to the telegraph office on Broad Street while everyone waited in tense silence. Legal documents had to be prepared, witnessed by 2 additional parties brought in from other businesses and stamped with official seals. And finally, Whitlock had to take physical delivery of the payment, which he had arranged to have transported from his bank in the form of gold coins that required 4 men to carry in locked chests. Throughout all of this, the woman stood silently on the platform, watching everything with that same unsettling composure. When the transaction was finally complete, when all papers had been signed and all money counted and verified, Whitlock approached her for the first time. He produced a key and unlocked the silk rope, binding her wrists. Unlike iron shackles, the rope left no marks on her skin. He handed her a shawl, which she draped over her shoulders with graceful efficiency. And then he did something that shocked every person still present in the auction house. He offered her his arm, as a gentleman would to a lady. She took it without hesitation, her movements suggesting she had expected exactly this gesture. Together they walked toward the exit, their posture suggesting partnership rather than ownership. At the doorway she paused and turned back to face the assembled crowd. In a voice clear and perfectly enunciated, with diction that revealed extensive education, impossible for an enslaved person to have acquired legally, she spoke her only words of the entire proceeding. "Some of you will sleep better now, some of you will sleep far worse, and some of you will discover that knowledge, once created, can never be truly destroyed. It only waits for the right moment to emerge from darkness." Then she walked out beside Whitlock into the Charleston sunlight and vanished from public record as completely as though she had never existed. The departure of Whitlock and his extraordinary purchase triggered immediate chaos in Charleston's highest circles. Within hours, rumors spread through the merchant district like wildfire through dry timber. By evening, 3 separate meetings were convened in private locations, gatherings of men who never assembled publicly, but whose combined wealth controlled nearly half of Charleston's commerce. They met behind locked doors, with trusted servants posted to ensure privacy, and they spoke in urgent whispers about a woman whose very existence threatened to unravel carefully constructed lies that had protected them for years. The questions multiplied faster than answers could be manufactured. Who had sold her? How had she acquired the knowledge she supposedly possessed? What exactly did she know about the Magnolia Plantation incident, the warehouse fire, the maritime disaster? And most urgently, who was Whitlock, and what did he intend to do with the information he had just purchased for $42,000? Marcus Ryan provided no answers. 2 days after the auction, he closed his business permanently, citing health concerns. He sold his building at a substantial loss to the first buyer who offered cash, packed his belongings, and departed Charleston on a ship bound for New Orleans. Before leaving, he burned every record of sales conducted in his establishment over the preceding 8 years, creating a bonfire in his courtyard that required the fire brigade to prevent it from spreading to neighboring buildings. When questioned by authorities about destroying business records required by law to be preserved, Ryan responded only that some transactions were better forgotten by everyone involved. The Charleston Mercury never published a follow-up to its cryptic 7-word mention of the auction. The editor, who had resigned the week after that brief notice, relocated to Atlanta, where he worked in obscure positions at several different newspapers before dying in 1863, having never written another article about Charleston commerce or society. But while official Charleston remained silent, private Charleston buzzed with speculation and fear. The coffee houses on Broad Street, where merchants gathered to discuss business, became centers of nervous conversation. Men who had been friends for decades began avoiding each other, uncertain who might be implicated in whatever scandals the mysterious woman knew about. Social invitations were declined without explanation, partnerships dissolved suddenly, and several prominent families abruptly announced plans to spend the winter in Europe, unusual for plantation owners who normally remained in South Carolina to oversee the harvest season. The first serious investigation into the woman's identity began 3 weeks after the auction, initiated by a lawyer named Harrison Calhoun. Calhoun specialized in property law and had built his practice defending the interests of Charleston's wealthiest families. He was known for his discretion, his thoroughness, and his willingness to operate in legal gray areas when clients required such flexibility. On November 1, 1854, he was retained by a group of 7 clients who refused to identify themselves publicly, but who provided him with substantial funds to uncover everything possible about Lot 47. Calhoun began with the notarized statement Marcus Ryan had read during the auction. He visited the courthouse, requesting to examine the original document supposedly witnessed by a Charleston magistrate on October 6. The clerk informed him that no such document existed in the public records. When Calhoun pressed for explanation, pointing out that Ryan had clearly read from authenticated papers, the clerk became defensive and suggested that perhaps the document had been filed incorrectly or had been removed for judicial review. But when Calhoun requested to speak with the magistrate whose seal had supposedly appeared on the papers, he discovered that Charleston employed 3 magistrates authorized to notarize such documents, and all 3 denied any knowledge of the transaction. This should have been impossible. Notarized documents required official seals, witnesses, and entries in record books designed specifically to prevent forgery. Yet somehow papers bearing what appeared to be legitimate authentication had materialized for the auction, then vanished completely from official archives. Calhoun next attempted to trace the seller. South Carolina law required that anyone consigning property for auction provide proof of ownership and legitimate transfer documents. These papers should have been filed with Ryan's business records and subsequently transferred to the courthouse when Ryan closed his establishment. But the bonfire Ryan had created destroyed everything. Calhoun interviewed Ryan's former clerks, discovering that the two men who had escorted the woman to the auction had arrived at Ryan's office 6 days before the sale, carrying documents that Ryan examined in private. The clerks remembered that Ryan had emerged from that meeting looking shaken, had poured himself a substantial whiskey despite the early hour, and had immediately sent a messenger to his attorney. That attorney, a man named Silas Pemberton, refused to speak with Calhoun or anyone else about the matter, citing client privilege. When Calhoun suggested that Ryan's abrupt departure and destruction of records might constitute suspicious activity worth investigating, Pemberton responded coolly that his client had violated no laws, that all transactions had been conducted legally, and that if certain parties found the auction's outcome uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine their own conduct rather than questioning legitimate business practices. The investigation reached its first significant breakthrough in late November, when Calhoun located one of the two men who had escorted the woman to the auction. His name was Thomas Burke, and he worked as a private courier specializing in sensitive deliveries and difficult assignments. For a substantial fee, Burke agreed to speak with Calhoun in a tavern near the docks, far from Charleston's fashionable districts where they might be recognized. Burke was cautious, choosing his words carefully, but he provided information that began to illuminate the situation. He had been hired in August, he explained, by a party who contacted him through an intermediary and offered exceptional payment for a single task. He was to travel to a specific location in the South Carolina Low Country, retrieve a package, and transport it safely to Charleston for delivery to Marcus Ryan. The location was a plantation house that had been abandoned for several years, standing empty except for a caretaker who visited periodically to prevent complete decay. When Burke arrived at this location with his partner, another courier named James Ridley, they found the woman waiting for them. She stood on the front porch of the abandoned house, dressed in the same blue cotton dress she would later wear to the auction, with a single leather bag containing her belongings. She handed Burke a sealed letter addressed to Marcus Ryan and informed him that she was the package they had been hired to transport. Burke admitted to being confused and disturbed by the situation. He asked the woman who she was, where she had come from, and why she needed transportation to Charleston. She responded with a calmness that Burke found deeply unsettling. "I am merchandise, with exceptional value," she said. "You have been paid to deliver me intact and unharmed. Beyond that, you need know nothing except that your employer will ensure you face no legal consequences for this transport." Burke and Ridley completed their assignment, delivering her to Ryan as instructed. They received their final payment from an anonymous source through a dead-drop arrangement that prevented them from ever identifying who had hired them. Burke never saw the woman again after leaving Ryan's auction house, and he insisted he had no knowledge of what happened to her after Whitlock claimed ownership. But Burke provided one additional detail that Calhoun found significant. During the 3-day journey from the abandoned plantation to Charleston, the woman spoke very little, but on the final evening, as they camped beside the road, she had looked at Burke with an expression he described as almost pitying. "You are wondering who I am and what I know," she said, "so I will tell you this much. I am someone who listened when powerful men believed no one was listening. I am someone who remembered when powerful men believed their secrets would be forgotten. And I am someone who discovered that knowledge becomes valuable only when those who possess power fear its revelation. You will not be harmed by your role in this affair, Mr. Burke, but others will lose everything they have built on foundations of lies. Remember this when you hear their names spoken in the months to come." Calhoun reported these findings to his anonymous clients, and their response was swift and decisive. They demanded he intensify his investigation, discover the woman's true identity, locate Whitlock, and determine what information had actually been purchased for $42,000. They provided additional funding and made it clear that no expense should be spared. But Calhoun's expanded investigation yielded frustration rather than answers. Whitlock had departed Charleston the same day as the auction, traveling north by private carriage. Inquiries sent to Boston, where his letter of credit originated, returned information that the bank holding his account was a small private institution that served wealthy clients who valued discretion above all else. The bank's officers refused to provide any information about Whitlock beyond confirming that his letter of credit had been legitimate and that funds were available to cover the $42,000 transaction. The abandoned plantation where Burke had retrieved the woman proved equally mysterious. Property records indicated it had belonged to a family named Ashton, prosperous rice planters who had abandoned the property in 1850 after the patriarch died without direct heirs. The estate had been tangled in legal disputes for several years, with distant relatives contesting the will and courts attempting to sort out competing claims. During this period, the plantation house stood empty, and no one could explain how the woman came to be there or who had arranged for her presence at that location, specifically for Burke to retrieve. Calhoun interviewed the caretaker who periodically visited the Ashton property. The man, an elderly freedman named Isaiah, who had worked for the Ashton family for decades, admitted he had seen the woman approximately 6 weeks before Burke arrived to collect her. She had simply appeared one morning, walking up the long drive to the house, as though she had every right to be there. Isaiah had challenged her, explaining the property was closed and she had no business there. She had smiled at him and said she was waiting for someone and would cause no trouble. Isaiah, troubled by her presence but uncertain what authority he possessed to force her departure, had allowed her to remain. She stayed in one of the upstairs bedrooms, kept herself clean, and fed from supplies Isaiah brought periodically, and spent her days sitting on the front porch, reading from a thick, leather-bound book she carried with her. Isaiah never learned what the book contained, but he noticed she turned its pages slowly, as though committing the contents to memory. She had an educated manner about her, Isaiah told Calhoun. Spoke proper English, better than most white folks I know. And she had this way of looking at you, like she could see right through whatever you were showing her and into what you really were underneath. Made me uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. But she never caused any trouble, never asked for anything beyond basic necessities. Just sat there day after day, reading that book and waiting. When Burke arrived to collect her, she had given the book to Isaiah, telling him to burn it after she departed. Isaiah admitted he had disobeyed this instruction. Instead, he had hidden the book in the plantation house, curious about what contents might be so important that they required destruction. But when he later retrieved the book and attempted to read it, he discovered it was written in a language he could not identify, symbols and characters that resembled no alphabet he had ever encountered. Calhoun persuaded Isaiah to show him this book. They traveled together to the abandoned Ashton plantation, and Isaiah led him to a hidden space beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the library. The book was there, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Calhoun examined it with growing confusion and wonder. The volume was perhaps 300 pages, hand-bound, its cover bearing no title or identification. The pages contained dense writing in what appeared to be some form of cipher or code, symbols arranged in regular patterns that suggested language but revealed no obvious meaning. Interspersed throughout the text were numbers, dates, names of locations, and occasionally English words or phrases that appeared without context. Calhoun recognized several names, prominent Charleston families, specific plantations, ships' names, but they appeared embedded in the coded text in ways that provided no clear meaning. On the final page, written in clear English, was a single sentence that made Calhoun's blood run cold. This record contains testimony of events witnessed between 1846 and 1853, recorded in cipher to protect the witness until such time as revelation becomes profitable or necessary. The key to this cipher has been transferred to one party who purchased knowledge with gold. All others will find these pages contain only mysteries that cannot be solved. Calhoun understood immediately what he was looking at. This was the source document, the record from which the woman's valuable knowledge derived. She had somehow witnessed events, conversations, transactions that Charleston's elite desperately wanted kept secret. She had recorded everything in code to protect herself, then sold the key to that code to Whitlock for $42,000. And this book, now useless without the cipher key, represented a fortune in information that would remain forever locked unless Whitlock chose to reveal it. The implications were staggering. This meant the woman had not merely stumbled upon dangerous information. She had systematically documented it, protected it, and waited years for the perfect moment to convert that knowledge into value. This required patience, intelligence, planning, and a willingness to endure continued enslavement while knowing she possessed information that could set her free. Who was capable of such discipline? What kind of mind could maintain such focus across years of waiting? Calhoun reported his findings to his clients, and their reaction confirmed his suspicions about the severity of the situation. They demanded he surrender the cipher book immediately, which he did, and they informed him that his services were no longer required. They paid him handsomely for his work, provided a substantial bonus for his discretion, and made it clear that he was to cease all investigation and never speak of the matter again. Harrison Calhoun accepted these terms, but before surrendering the book, he had copied several pages, including the final English sentence, thinking these copies might prove valuable should circumstances change. He locked these copies in his office safe, where they would remain for nearly 4 decades before anyone discovered them. Meanwhile, throughout December of 1854 and into January of the new year, Charleston experienced what could only be described as a quiet panic among its elite. Men who had built fortunes on cotton, rice, and enslaved labor found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering which secrets might emerge, which past crimes might be exposed. Several prominent figures suddenly announced retirements, selling their businesses and properties at disadvantageous prices in apparent haste to liquidate assets and depart South Carolina. Others grew paranoid, suspecting surveillance, hiring private guards, conducting their business with new levels of secrecy that bordered on the absurd. And then the revelations began. The first came in February 1855, when a shipping company based in Charleston declared bankruptcy after its primary investor withdrew all funding without explanation. The company's collapse seemed routine until investigators examining the firm's records for creditors discovered systematic fraud dating back to 1848. The company had been reporting cargo loads to investors that were substantially larger than what was actually transported, pocketing the difference through falsified bills of lading and corrupted customs officials. The maritime incident of September 1848, mentioned in the auction statement, apparently referred to a shipment that had supposedly been lost in a storm but had actually been sold through illegal channels, with company officers claiming insurance payments for cargo that had never been lost. The scandal destroyed 3 family fortunes and led to criminal charges against 7 men. During the investigation, one of those charged committed suicide, leaving a note that mentioned only, "She knew. She was there. We believed her invisible, and that belief has destroyed us." The second revelation emerged in April, when a fire at a Charleston warehouse uncovered evidence of a previous fire in April 1851 that had been deliberately set to destroy account books documenting illegal slave trading. South Carolina, like all American states after 1808, prohibited the importation of enslaved people from Africa. But substantial profits could be made by smuggling Africans into Charleston and selling them to plantation owners who asked no questions about origin. A conspiracy involving customs officials, ship captains, and wealthy buyers had operated for years, using that warehouse to temporarily house illegal shipments before distribution inland. When investigators grew too curious in 1851, the warehouse had been burned, destroying evidence and allowing the conspirators to continue operating. Now, 4 years later, someone had provided authorities with detailed documentation of the conspiracy, including names, dates, ships involved, and amounts paid. The source of this information was never officially disclosed, but rumors circulated that an anonymous package had been delivered to the federal marshal's office, containing documents so detailed and accurate that prosecution became inevitable. 7 men were charged with federal crimes, and 2 of Charleston's most prominent families saw their wealth confiscated by authorities. The third and most devastating revelation involved the Magnolia Plantation incident of June 19, 1849. This event had been successfully suppressed for years, known only to a handful of people who had participated directly or who had been paid substantial sums to remain silent. But in August 1855, an article appeared in a Boston abolitionist newspaper providing horrific details of what had transpired that summer evening. According to the article, a gathering at Magnolia Plantation had been organized by several Charleston families to discuss strategies for responding to increasing northern criticism of slavery. The meeting had been held in secret, attended by perhaps 20 of the city's most powerful men. During this meeting, while the gentlemen discussed political strategies over whiskey and cigars, a situation had developed among the enslaved workers serving the gathering. One young woman, a house servant perhaps 16 years old, had apparently overheard conversations that revealed criminal activities several of the guests wanted concealed. When this was discovered, a decision was made that the woman represented an unacceptable risk. What followed was never officially documented, but witnesses later testified that she had been taken from the house under the pretense of punishment, led into the fields beyond the main buildings, and had simply vanished. No record of her sale existed. No transfer of ownership was documented. She simply ceased to exist, and no one asked questions because the men responsible possessed enough power to ensure silence. The Boston article provided names, specific details of conversations that had occurred that night, and descriptions of who had made the decision and who had carried it out. The information was so precise, so accurate in its details, that it could only have come from someone who had been present, who had witnessed everything, who had remembered it all. The article concluded with a paragraph that sent shockwaves through Charleston when copies reached the city. The source of this information is a woman who served that evening alongside the murdered girl, who heard everything, saw everything, and remembered everything. For years she remained silent, understanding that speaking would mean her own death. But silence became profitable only when those with most to lose feared exposure more than they valued their secrets. This woman has now sold her testimony to parties who will ensure it reaches those capable of demanding justice. Charleston's gentlemen may have believed their slaves blind and deaf to their crimes. They have learned, too late, that invisibility is not the same as absence. If you're disturbed by how these powerful men treated human beings as disposable, you're exactly who needs to hear these stories. Hit that like button and leave a comment about what you think should happen to people who commit such crimes. And share this video because history this dark needs to be brought into the light. Now let's continue to discover who this woman really was and how she survived long enough to make Charleston's elite pay for their sins. The Boston article triggered fury in Charleston. Several prominent men demanded investigations into who had provided the information, threatening lawsuits against the newspaper for libel and defamation. But the article had been carefully written, presenting itself as testimony from an anonymous witness rather than making direct accusations. And, critically, the Boston paper refused to identify its source or even confirm that such a person existed, citing the need to protect witnesses from retaliation. No criminal charges resulted from the article. Too much time had passed. Too many of those involved had died or left South Carolina, and the legal system remained controlled by the same class of men who had been implicated. But the social consequences were severe. Several families found themselves quietly shunned by others who feared association with scandal. Business partnerships dissolved. A cotton factor named Edmund Grayson, specifically named in the article as having participated in the decision to eliminate the witness, discovered that banks would no longer extend him credit. Within a year, he had lost his business and his Charleston townhouse, forced to retreat to a family property in the rural Low Country, where he lived in increasing isolation until his death in 1859. Throughout these revelations, one question dominated private conversations among Charleston's shaken elite. Where was Whitlock? What was he doing with the information he had purchased? And who was the woman he had taken north after the auction? The answer to these questions would not emerge for nearly 3 decades, and when it finally did, the truth proved more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The search for Whitlock and the woman he had purchased consumed Harrison Calhoun's thoughts long after his official investigation ended. Despite being paid to cease his inquiries, despite the clear warning from his anonymous clients that further pursuit would be unwise, Calhoun found himself unable to let the matter rest. He had glimpsed something in that coded book, in the careful planning that had orchestrated the auction, in the cold precision with which Charleston's elite were being systematically destroyed. This was not random revenge or opportunistic blackmail. This was calculated justice, executed with patience that suggested years of planning. In September of 1855, Calhoun received an envelope delivered to his office by a messenger who could provide no information about who had sent it. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from a Philadelphia publication dated 3 weeks earlier. The article was brief, buried on an interior page between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of public lectures. It announced that a private academy for freedmen and women had been established in Philadelphia through the generous donation of an anonymous benefactor. The school would provide education in reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills to formerly enslaved people seeking to build new lives in the North. The article noted that the Academy's funding appeared substantial, suggesting the anonymous donor possessed considerable wealth and a commitment to the cause of Negro education. The clipping included no explanation, no message, nothing to indicate why it had been sent to Calhoun specifically, but he understood immediately. This was where the $42,000 had gone, or at least part of it. Whitlock had not purchased the woman's knowledge for his own benefit or for blackmail purposes. He had purchased it to fund her freedom and her revenge, and now that revenge was complete enough to begin redirecting resources towards something constructive. Calhoun kept the clipping in his desk drawer and said nothing to anyone. But he began following northern newspapers more closely, searching for patterns, looking for evidence of the woman's continued activity. He found it, though piecing together the fragments required months of careful attention. In November 1855, a Boston legal firm, specializing in abolitionist causes, received an anonymous donation of $15,000, funding that allowed them to expand their efforts defending fugitive slaves and challenging the legal framework supporting slavery. In January 1856, a freedmen's community in upstate New York received a substantial grant to purchase farmland, allowing formerly enslaved families to establish independent agricultural operations. In March, a publishing house in Philadelphia received funding to print and distribute slave narratives, first-hand accounts of life under bondage that northern audiences rarely encountered. Each donation came from different sources, channeled through different intermediaries, impossible to trace back to any single origin. But Calhoun recognized the pattern. Someone with substantial resources and clear purpose was systematically funding the infrastructure of abolition, strengthening the networks that helped enslaved people escape, supporting the legal and political challenges to slavery's expansion, building the foundation for a society in which her own experience of bondage might become impossible. And throughout this period, additional revelations continued to emerge about Charleston crimes. In April 1856, federal authorities received detailed documentation of a bank fraud scheme that had operated between 1849 and 1853, involving the manipulation of cotton prices through coordinated false reporting. 3 Charleston merchants were charged with federal crimes, and 1 committed suicide before trial. In July, customs officials discovered evidence of systematic bribery dating back years, leading to the dismissal of 7 officials and criminal charges against 2 supervisors. Each revelation was accompanied by anonymous documentation so detailed, so precise, that it could only have come from someone who had been present during the original events. Someone who had stood in rooms while powerful men spoke freely, believing that enslaved servants were incapable of understanding or remembering complex financial schemes. Someone who had absorbed everything, recorded everything, and waited years for the moment when that knowledge could be weaponized. Charleston's elite began to understand what they faced. This was not a single act of blackmail or revenge. This was systematic demolition, a campaign designed to expose every crime, every conspiracy, every buried secret that the city's powerful families had accumulated across decades. And there was no way to negotiate, no way to buy silence, because the knowledge had already been sold and the proceeds were being used to fund the destruction of the institution that had enabled those crimes in the first place. The psychological impact on Charleston society was profound. Men who had committed no crimes beyond the ordinary cruelties of slave ownership found themselves paranoid, wondering if their own servants might be listening, remembering, waiting. Trust eroded. Long-time business partnerships dissolved over mutual suspicion. Some families began treating their household servants with uncharacteristic caution, afraid that any conversation might be overheard and documented by someone patient enough to wait years before converting that knowledge into weapons. In the midst of this slow-motion collapse of Charleston's social order, a few individuals began asking different questions. Not who was the woman or where was she now, but how had she accomplished what seemed impossible? How does an enslaved woman learn to read and write in a society that made such education illegal? How does she gain access to the private business dealings of Charleston's elite? How does she record and encode information while remaining invisible to those she was documenting? And most remarkably, how does she maintain the patience and discipline required to endure years of continued slavery while possessing knowledge that could set her free, waiting for the perfect moment to convert that knowledge into maximum value? The first partial answer to these questions emerged in 1873, nearly 2 decades after the auction. A Confederate veteran named Robert Ashford published a memoir of his wartime experiences, and among the various anecdotes about battles and campaigns, he included a curious passage about a conversation he had overheard in Charleston before the war. According to Ashford's account, in the spring of 1856, he had attended a dinner party where several older gentlemen discussed the auction scandal that had shaken the city. One man, whom Ashford identified only as a prominent rice planter, spoke with bitter admiration about the woman who had caused such destruction. "We created her," the planter said, according to Ashford's recollection. "We brought that particular doom upon ourselves through our own arrogance and carelessness. You want to know how a slave learned to read? We taught her. You want to know how she gained access to our business dealings? We brought her into our offices and homes, believing her presence no different from furniture. We spoke freely in front of her because we believed she lacked the capacity to understand what we discussed. And when she demonstrated intelligence that made us uncomfortable, we convinced ourselves it was impossible, that we were imagining things, because acknowledging her mind meant acknowledging our crime. The planter had continued, his voice growing quieter according to Ashford's memory. I knew her before she came to auction. She served in my household for 3 years, and I watched her learn to read by studying books when she believed no one observed her. I watched her memorize conversations, replaying them silently with perfect accuracy. I watched her understand complex financial discussions that most men struggle to follow. And I did nothing, said nothing, because acknowledging what I saw would have required acknowledging that we held in bondage a mind superior to my own. That realization was intolerable, so I chose blindness, as did many others. And that blindness allowed her to become what she became, a threat so devastating that her knowledge alone was worth more than most plantations. Ashford's memoir generated minimal interest when published. The war had ended 8 years earlier, and few readers cared about pre-war Charleston scandals. But the passage would later prove crucial to researchers attempting to understand the woman's story. The second significant breakthrough came in 1881, when a Philadelphia teacher named Catherine Winters published a collection of oral histories gathered from formerly enslaved people living in northern communities. Among these interviews was an account provided by an elderly woman identified only as Harriet, who had been enslaved in Charleston before escaping to Pennsylvania in 1857. Harriet's testimony included a remarkable passage about a woman she had known briefly in Charleston, someone she described as the most dangerous person I ever met, though she appeared to those who owned her as perfectly docile and unremarkable. According to Harriet's account, this woman had been passed among several Charleston households over a span of more than 10 years, sold and resold not because she proved difficult, but because she made her owners vaguely uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate. She worked as a house servant, performing her duties with efficiency and silence, never causing trouble, never attracting attention. But she possessed a quality that unsettled those who spent time around her, a sense that she was observing everything with an intelligence that should not exist in someone of her legal status. She would stand in the corner of a room while gentlemen conducted business, Harriet recalled, and they would forget she was there after a few minutes. They would discuss matters of great importance, money and property and schemes that would make them richer, and she would remain silent and still, appearing to pay no attention whatsoever. But I knew her secret. She was memorizing every word. She could recall entire conversations weeks or months later, repeating them with perfect accuracy, mimicking even the voices and gestures of the men who had spoken. She showed me this ability once, in private, and it frightened me so badly that I never asked her to demonstrate it again. Harriet continued with a detail that would prove essential to understanding the woman's strategy. She told me once that invisibility was the greatest weapon an enslaved person could possess. If they saw you as human, they watched you carefully, suspecting danger. If they saw you as property, as furniture with breath, they let their guard down completely. She said she had learned to make herself invisible by appearing exactly what they expected, nothing more and nothing less. And while invisible, she could see everything they tried to hide. Catherine Winters's book received modest attention in abolitionist circles, but made no broader cultural impact. The oral histories it contained were considered interesting, but not particularly significant compared to the slave narratives written by famous figures like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs. But researchers would later recognize Harriet's testimony as one of the few first-hand accounts of the woman's actual methodology. The most detailed information about what happened after Whitlock purchased the woman would not emerge until 1903, nearly 50 years after the auction. That year, an attorney in Boston died, and among his effects was a sealed letter with instructions that it should be opened only after his death, and its contents made available to historians researching antebellum Charleston. The attorney's name was Jonathan Whitlock, son of the man who had purchased Lot 47 in 1854. The younger Whitlock had inherited his father's papers, and the sealed letter contained a detailed account of the transaction and its aftermath, written by the elder Whitlock before his own death in 1879. According to this document, Jonathan Whitlock Sr. had been approached in July of 1854 by an intermediary representing an unnamed party who possessed information of value to multiple Charleston families. The intermediary explained that this information was controlled by an enslaved woman who had documented evidence of crimes committed between 1846 and 1853. The woman wanted to sell this information, but she required certain conditions to be met before any transaction could occur. First, she wanted to be purchased by someone who had no connection to Charleston society, someone who could not be pressured or threatened by the families whose secrets she possessed. Second, she required a guarantee that the proceeds from her sale would be used to fund abolitionist causes and to establish her own freedom in the North. Third, she insisted that the information she provided would be released gradually, strategically, in ways designed to cause maximum damage to the individuals who had committed the most egregious crimes while minimizing harm to enslaved people who might suffer from chaotic collapse of social order. Whitlock, a committed abolitionist who had made his fortune in northern shipping, agreed to these terms. He traveled to Charleston, examined the coded documentation the woman had created, verified its authenticity through consultations with sources who could confirm some of the details, and determined that the information was indeed valuable enough to justify the extraordinary price. He arrived at Ryan's auction house, prepared to pay up to $50,000 if necessary, though the final price of $42,000 represented significant savings. After the auction, Whitlock transported the woman to Pennsylvania, where legal procedures were initiated to formalize her freedom. The process was complicated by South Carolina law, which did not recognize voluntary manumission in many circumstances, but Whitlock's attorneys navigated the legal complexities successfully. By January 1855, the woman possessed legal documents establishing her status as a free person, though she chose to keep her former enslaved name as a reminder of what she had endured. Over the next 3 years, she worked with Whitlock to systematically release the information she had documented, choosing targets carefully, timing revelations for maximum impact, ensuring that each exposure served both justice and the broader cause of abolition. She demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking, understanding not just what to reveal, but when and how to reveal it for optimal effect. Whitlock's letter included one additional detail that researchers would find fascinating. He described the woman's emotional state during this period as remarkably controlled, almost unnaturally calm. She showed no obvious anger when discussing the men who had enslaved her, no visible satisfaction when their crimes were exposed. Instead, she approached the entire project with the detachment of someone conducting a business transaction, methodical and thorough but emotionally distant. "I asked her once," Whitlock wrote, "whether she felt any joy in seeing these men destroyed. She considered the question for a long moment before responding. 'Joy requires freedom I do not yet possess,' she said. 'I am free by law, but not yet free in my own mind. That freedom will come only when I have rebuilt my life into something beyond reaction to what was done to me. Until then, this work is simply necessary, like removing infection from a wound. One does not celebrate the removal. One simply removes it and moves forward." Whitlock's letter concluded with information that researchers had sought for decades. The woman's name, her origins, and what became of her after her revenge was complete. Her name was Eliza Rothman, and she had been born in Charleston in 1824, the daughter of an enslaved woman and a Jewish merchant who refused to acknowledge his paternity. Her mother had been unusually educated, taught to read and write by a previous owner who believed in educating household servants despite the law forbidding such practice. Her mother passed this education to Eliza in secret, using books stolen from the libraries of the homes where she worked. When Eliza was 14, her mother died of fever, and Eliza was sold to pay estate debts. Over the next 16 years, she passed through the hands of 7 different Charleston families, each sale occurring after she had remained with one owner long enough to make them uncomfortable. She never explained what made her unsettling, but her owners sensed something in her quiet competence that felt threatening despite her perfect obedience. During these years, Eliza had access to the private business dealings of some of Charleston's wealthiest men. She served in their offices when they conducted confidential negotiations. She stood in their homes when they hosted meetings where illegal schemes were planned. She was present in rooms where crimes were casually discussed and dismissed. And she remembered everything, her eidetic memory allowing her to retain conversations, names, dates, and details with perfect accuracy. In 1846, Eliza began recording what she witnessed, using a cipher she created by combining elements of Hebrew, which her father had taught her in the brief periods when he acknowledged her existence, and a numerical code based on patterns she had observed in shipping manifests and account books. She wrote in stolen notebooks, hiding her documentation in various locations around Charleston, creating redundant copies to protect against discovery. By 1853, she possessed enough information to destroy dozens of powerful men, but she waited, understanding that timing was everything. Releasing information while still enslaved would mean her death. She needed to convert her knowledge into freedom first, and that required finding a buyer willing to purchase not just her body but the information she possessed under conditions that guaranteed her safety. The auction in 1854 was the culmination of 2 years of careful planning, negotiating through intermediaries, establishing conditions, and finally arranging her own sale in a way that maximized both the price and her security. After establishing her freedom, after completing her campaign of revelation, Eliza left Pennsylvania and relocated to Ohio, where she established a school for freedmen and women. She taught reading, writing, and practical skills, using the remainder of the money from her sale to fund operations. The school operated quietly, never seeking publicity, serving perhaps 30 students each year. If stories like this fascinate you, stories buried in history, waiting in sealed rooms to be discovered, then you're in the right place. This is exactly what the Sealed Room is all about, bringing these hidden truths into the light. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these extraordinary stories that history tried to forget. Eliza Rothman lived until 1897, dying at age 73 in a small house adjacent to the school she had founded. Her obituary in the local Ohio newspaper made no mention of her early life, describing her simply as an educator who had dedicated her later years to teaching formerly enslaved people. No one at her funeral knew that she had once sold for $42,000, that her knowledge had destroyed some of Charleston's most powerful families, or that she had demonstrated a form of patient, calculated resistance that few could imagine, much less execute. But the story continued beyond her death, because information has a way of persisting across generations, waiting for the right moment to emerge from darkness. The decades following Eliza Rothman's death brought profound changes to America. The Civil War had ended slavery. Reconstruction had attempted and ultimately failed to establish racial equality, and a new century dawned with promises of progress that would prove as elusive as they were earnest. But in Charleston, among families who had survived the war and its aftermath, certain stories persisted in whispered conversations, passed from one generation to the next with warnings attached. Stories about the woman who had destroyed their grandfather's fortunes, who had exposed their crimes, who had demonstrated that no secret remains buried forever when someone patient enough waits for the right moment to excavate it. The coded book that Eliza had created, the one Harrison Calhoun had discovered in the abandoned Ashton plantation, passed through several hands after Calhoun's anonymous clients confiscated it from him. They attempted for years to decipher it, hiring linguists and code breakers, offering rewards for anyone who could unlock its contents. All efforts failed. Without the key that Eliza had sold to Whitlock, the book remained impenetrable, a taunting reminder of information they could see but never read, knowledge that existed just beyond their reach. In 1872, the book disappeared from the private collection where it had been secured. No record explained how it vanished or who took it. But 15 years later, in 1887, portions of its contents began appearing in scholarly publications focused on antebellum Charleston economics. The articles, written by various historians using archival research, documented business practices, financial schemes, and social arrangements that had characterized Charleston's elite before the war. The information was presented academically, with careful citations and measured language, but those familiar with Charleston's buried history recognized the details as matching crimes that had been exposed 3 decades earlier. Someone had deciphered the book, someone had access to Eliza's complete documentation, and they were releasing it gradually through legitimate scholarly channels, transforming her revenge into historical record, ensuring that the crimes she had witnessed would be preserved not as scandal, but as documented fact studied by students and researchers generations into the future. The identity of this person would remain unknown until 1923, when a professor at Howard University named Marcus Whitlock, grandson of the man who had purchased Eliza in 1854, published a comprehensive history of Charleston's antebellum economy. The book, titled Foundations of Prosperity, The Hidden Architecture of Southern Wealth, drew heavily on primary sources that Marcus explained had been provided to him by his grandfather before the elder Whitlock's death. In the book's introduction, Marcus revealed what previous generations had kept private. His grandfather had not merely purchased Eliza's knowledge, he had purchased her trust. And, in return for that trust, she had provided him not just with the cipher key to decode her book, but with detailed verbal explanations of context, significance, and connections that the written record alone could not convey. Over the 3 years she worked with the elder Whitlock, she had essentially provided him with a complete oral history of Charleston's economic crimes, information that he had carefully documented and preserved. When Eliza left Pennsylvania for Ohio, she had given Whitlock permission to use this information however he believed would best serve the cause of truth and justice. But she requested that the release be delayed until after her death, not wanting her later life as an educator to be overshadowed by her earlier life as a witness and avenger. Whitlock honored this request, keeping the documentation sealed until Eliza's death in 1897, then gradually releasing portions through academic channels that would treat the information with appropriate seriousness. Marcus Whitlock's book was well received in academic circles, though it generated controversy in Charleston, where some families still possessed enough influence to object to the public examination of their ancestors' crimes. But by 1923, enough time had passed that these objections carried little weight. The book became required reading in several university history programs and established Marcus Whitlock as a leading scholar of Southern economic history. But Marcus's book also contained information that scholars had not previously known, details about Eliza herself that filled gaps in the historical record. He revealed that Eliza had not worked alone in her documentation project. She had been part of a network of enslaved people in Charleston who shared information, who warned each other about dangerous owners, who maintained their own system of intelligence gathering that operated beneath the awareness of white society. This network had existed for decades, perhaps longer, consisting primarily of household servants who had access to private conversations and confidential documents. They could not read or write in most cases, so they relied on oral transmission, passing information through trusted channels, building collective knowledge about which families could be trusted and which represented danger. Eliza, with her unusual education and her remarkable memory,